The annual Flaxborough flower and produce show was not, by tradition, the sort of gathering where one expected gasps of horror. Mild disapproval, yes, at onions too aggressively inflated by fertilizer, or dahlias suspiciously symmetrical, but never horror. Yet on this particular Saturday afternoon, with bunting streaming from the parish hall and the mayor poised to present the silver cup for best root vegetable, the crowd's polite applause gave way to a scream. Among an arrangement of prize marrows, sprawled rather indecorously between a jar of runner beans and a victorious cabbage, lay the body of Councillor Edgar Hartley. His expression was frozen in mild surprise, the sort of look one might wear at discovering the soup was tinned. A gardening fork protruded from his side, absurdly out of place among the vegetables that had been judged for neatness not an hour earlier. Children were hurried away. Elderly ladies fluttered like curtains in a draught, and the vicar, who had intended to bless the cakes next, found that all solemn words had fled. It was, in short, the most exciting thing to happen at the flower show since Mrs. Clegg's lemon curd had spontaneously ignited. The body was removed, discreetly covered with a tarpaulin borrowed from the horticultural stall, but the speculation was already blooming faster than any chrysanthemum. At the pub that evening, the theories sprouted like weeds. "Mark my words," muttered Mr. Binns, the chemist. "It's the allotments committee. All jealousies start there. I heard Hartley had a meeting behind the church vestry that morning," whispered Mrs. Thorpe, who normally confined herself to whispering about hymn choices. "Nonsense," declared Mr. Spaulding, a butcher with a talent for stating himself loudly. "He was always up to the council offices early. Someone didn't want him arriving." "He had enemies, certainly," said the landlady, polishing a glass with menacing clarity, "but not the sort you catch with marrows." "Whole thing's an accident," insisted Alderman Price when contacted by telephone. "Utterly regrettable, yes. Murder, no. Probably slipped on a courgette." Each assertion contradicted the last, and each added fuel to the buzzing village hive. By nightfall, Flaxborough had promoted itself collectively into both coroner and detective, albeit with quite different verdicts, depending on which bar stool one occupied. Inspector Purbright, arriving in his drab police Wolseley with Sergeant Love at his side, approached the now deserted parish hall with his usual air of polite detachment. The vegetables had been cleared, the cups stacked, and the stage stripped of bunting, but one thing remained curiously out of place. Near the prize table, lying half hidden beneath a discarded raffle ticket, was a small silver watch chain. It gleamed faintly in the hall's gaslight, though the watch that ought to have been attached was conspicuously absent. Purbright stooped. He did not pick it up immediately. He allowed himself first a long pause, as though rehearsing how differently others might overlook it. Finally, producing a handkerchief, he lifted the chain into a paper envelope. "Sir," Sergeant Love asked eagerly, leaning forward like a schoolboy. Purbright's eyes went not to the chain, but to the otherwise immaculate alignment of the vegetable displays. Someone had disturbed the arrangement after judging, then taken trouble to disguise it. Purbright's gaze moved higher, to the parish clock that overlooked the square outside. It had stopped 20 minutes past 3, a time confirmed by the town hall caretaker as precisely when the judging ended. He did not say anything further, but tapped his finger gently on the notebook cover where he had written, simply, 3:20. Clock stopped, watch missing. Did you spot what Purbright noticed? Later, when Sergeant Love suggested perhaps the murder had been born of sudden rage, the result of some agricultural slight, perhaps over marrow girth, Purbright merely looked at him with quiet patience. "My dear Love," he said, "few men bring silver watch chains to quarrels among vegetables." The line was delivered softly, almost as if addressed to no one in particular, but it reframed the disorder of the flower show into questions far more troubling. The fork was obvious, yes, but the watch chain, the stopped clock, these were appointments kept not by gardeners, but by conspirators. Love, unused to subtlety but loyal in his attempt to keep pace, nodded gravely as though understanding, then wrote in his own notebook, "Silver chain equals suspicious." Purbright gave a gentle sigh, which might have been mistaken for amusement were it not so respectfully quiet. As the inspector replaced his pencil, a constable hurried across the square. He looked pale, as one might after hearing a hymn played backwards. "Sir," he said breathlessly, "we've just had a report. Councillor Hartley was seen alive at 3:30 walking into the council offices." Love blinked. "But, sir, that would be after he was already dead here." Purbright closed his notebook. His glance strayed toward the unmoving face of the parish clock, its hands stubbornly fixed upon 20 minutes past. "Quite so," he murmured. "Which suggests, does it not, that Flaxborough currently hosts either a ghost or an excellent impersonator?" More answers in Chapter 2. But first, what's your theory? Who was it that entered the council offices at 3:30? Drop your thoughts below. The parish clock stared down on Flaxborough Square with its blank, frozen face, a timepiece that had ceased to be helpful and become instead a mute witness. Beneath its tower, Inspector Purbright stood motionless, gazing at the darkened windows of the council offices across the street. Sergeant Love shifted uncomfortably at his side, fumbling with his notebook as though the act of handling paper might lend him clarity. "Alive at 3:30, Love repeated, almost to himself. "The witness must be confused, sir. Councillor Hartley was already, arranged among the vegetables by then." Purbright's eyes wandered back to the town hall facade before lingering on the council chamber window. One light still glowed. "Confused, perhaps," he said mildly. "But one has to admit, Love, confusion is just what impostors depend upon." They crossed the square slowly. The aftermath of the flower and produce show was scattered around them in forlorn traces. Dropped raffle tickets, a lone cucumber that had rolled into the gutter, 2 paper flags wilting on their sticks. A dusk chill was settling, and the sound of the last milk cart clattered faintly down a side lane. The police constable who had brought the report waited at the council steps. His face was the flushed pink of someone who had brought urgent news only to find it doubted. "Mrs. Thistlethwaite, sir," he explained quickly. "She swears she saw Councillor Hartley enter through those doors at 3:30. Said she was watching the street from her sitting-room window at the time. Nothing particular to do, she said, only waiting for her daughter to bring the shopping." "Mrs. Thistlethwaite," Purbright repeated with reflective calm. "An industrious observer of comings and goings. Love, I think we had better start where she saw and follow where it leads." Love scribbled down the name with dutiful strokes. "Do you mean we're to question her now this evening, sir?" "Indeed. Memories are like chrysanthemums, Love. They wilt quickly without proper tending." They walked on to the modest row where Mrs. Thistlethwaite lived, a neat brick terrace with lace curtains and a small patch of garden in which Marigold stood stiffly at attention. The lady herself greeted them at her doorway with a combination of solemnity and excitement that only tragedy in one's own neighborhood can provoke. "Come in, Inspector Sergeant." She ushered them into a sitting room that smelled of lavender polish and persistent cabbage. It was him, no doubt of it. Walked quickly, as though late. Carried a small black briefcase, just the sort he always had for meetings. Purbright inclined his head gravely. "And the time, madam?" Her chin tilted proudly. "I'd just wound the mantel clock. I set it straight by the wireless chimes. 3:30 exactly." He stepped into the council offices, and I said to myself, "There you are, Mrs. Thistlethwaite. Councillor Hartley's late for his papers again." "Did you see him leave?" Purbright asked. She paused only a second. "No, Inspector, but I didn't watch beyond 10 minutes later. Had to put the kettle on for my neighbor." Sergeant Love looked doubtful. Could be someone somewhat similar in appearance. Councilmen do wear much the same hats and coats. "It was Hartley," Mrs. Thistlethwaite said with finality. "No mistaking." Purbright gave her a polite smile that might have meant agreement or might simply have meant thank you. "You have been very helpful, madam." Back in the street, Love huffed impatiently. "But it can't have been Hartley, can it, sir? How could the man be walking into the council offices alive when you'd already seen him stiff among the beans?" Purbright stepped around a puddle with deliberate care. How indeed? His tone carried no irony, only the kind of gentle curiosity one applies when prodding a hedgehog with a stick. They returned at once to the council building. By now, the caretaker was locking up the ground floor. He proved awkward, every caretaker does, when asked questions that imply the negligence. "Nobody came in after 2 o'clock when the clerks left," the man insisted stubbornly. "I've had an eye on this place all afternoon." "Nevertheless," Purbright murmured, "the building may conceal unexpected thoroughfares. Show us through, if you please." Reluctantly, they were guided inside. The empty corridors smelled faintly of ink and floor polish. Notice boards displayed meeting times, while a line of leather chairs stood like penitents outside the mayor's office. They climbed the narrow staircase, each board groaning beneath them, until the second-floor corridor stretched ahead. Halfway along, Purbright stopped. Something had caught his eye, just a tiny smear of damp on the otherwise polished linoleum. "Here, Love, observe. A footprint? No sole pattern, but slightly muddy at the toe." He bent closer. "The soil looks fresh. Country mud, perhaps from a field. Not the sort one collects in council chambers." Love produced his notebook instantly, delighted to have something tangible. "So perhaps Hartley wasn't quite dead after all, sir. That is, stabbed but still moving about?" Purbright did not dispute, but nor did he confirm. From the end of the corridor came a faint smell of smoke. They followed their noses to the mayor's office, where the fireplace held the grey residue of hastily burned paper. The caretaker threw up his hands. "That's no doing of mine. I haven't lit that fire this week." Purbright bent over the grate. Among the ashes, a single scrap had resisted the flame. The corner of a typed letter with half a word remaining, something like posel or poselites. He lifted it with his pencil and tucked it carefully into his envelope. "Interesting timing," he said softly, "for documents to meet the fire just when their owner selects the company of beans." Love scratched his head. If it was Hartley here all along, then who's the Hartley in the hall? Purbright gave him a long glance of quiet amusement. "The question, Love, might be put another way. If Hartley was in the hall, then who in council offices went to the trouble of looking convincingly like him?" They retraced their steps to the square. The clock above them continued its stubborn insistence that time had halted. Purbright gazed up at it once more, thoughtful lines around his mouth. "An impersonator, Sergeant, needs 2 things: resemblance and motive. Resemblance narrows the number of possibilities in a town of our size. Motive, on the other hand." He let the idea dangle in the night air, as if saving it for later exploration. Love shuffled beside him, not satisfied but unwilling to contradict. "So, our next step, sir?" Purbright looked down the street where lamps were flickering into life, each playing its part in comforting the town despite the disturbance in its heart. "Our next step, Love, is to learn not who hated Hartley, for I dare say that range is broad, but who stood to speak in his voice, and whether that voice intended to mislead us or merely dance upon his grave." The sergeant blinked and dutifully noted the possible impersonator in his book with heavy strokes. Behind them, the parish hall stood silent once more, but within its empty space the memory of the afternoon scandal seemed almost to linger. Tomorrow, Flaxborough would awaken eager for more gossip. For Purbright, the puzzle had only just acquired its teeth. The following morning dawned clean and pale, as though the town had decided to scrub itself in readiness for gossip. The parish clock, still unmoving, stood as the square's silent centerpiece. For most of Flaxborough, its frozen hands were an inconvenience. For Inspector Purbright, they were a persistent reminder that the murder of Councillor Hartley had chosen not only a victim, but a timepiece to mark the moment. He and Sergeant Love arrived early at the police station, where a modest pile of witness statements awaited them. Half of these consisted of vague impressions heard second-hand at the flower show. The remainder, firmly opinionated assertions delivered by citizens who considered themselves sleuths in their own right. Love thumbed through them with earnest skepticism. "Most of these aren't any use, sir. One woman swears she saw Councillor Hartley buying rhubarb jam at a stall 10 minutes before he was found dead, but there is no jam sold in jars at the flower show, only in tarts. Another insists she heard him arguing with the mayor in the tea tent, but the mayor wasn't even present until the scream brought him waddling over." "Contradictions," Purbright remarked mildly, pouring himself tea from a dented pot, "are useful seeds, Love. It is usually what people are certain of which proves most deceptive." Their first call that day was to the late councillor's residence, an imposing red brick house with lace-curtained windows, more dignified than warm. Mrs. Hartley, tall and slightly rigid, received them in a drawing-room that smelled of mothballs and restrained emotions. "My husband," she said, voice level but clipped, "was a man preoccupied with civic duty. He scarcely had time for anything else. Whoever has brought this calamity upon us has done so out of envy or petty spite." Love asked cautiously. "Had he enemies, ma'am?" Her laugh was brief, humorless. "Everyone on the council is someone's enemy, Sergeant." It is practically the job description, but Edgar's true opponent was disorder, and he met it bravely. She paused, then added in a quieter tone, "You will not disgrace him with rumors, Inspector." Purbright inclined his head with gentle courtesy. "Rumors tend to disgrace themselves, madam. We collect them only to see whether they knock against one another." She hesitated, then confessed more candidly. "Last week he was not himself. He came home restless, sometimes quite late after meetings. I asked if matters at the council were difficult, but he replied only that he had obligations. Obligations people would not understand. He refused to elaborate." Purbright let silence follow, for silence often made confessions lengthen. But Mrs. Hartley, resolute once more, said nothing further. In the hallway as they left, Love whispered, "Obligations," she said. "Sounds suspicious, doesn't it?" "It sounds," Purbright replied low, "like the sort of word one employs when one wishes to sound dutiful while disguising something else entirely. Obligation to whom, I wonder?" Their route next took them to the municipal offices, where clerks abounded in sensible coats and harried demeanors. One in particular, a Mr. Larkin, produced another oddity. Councillor Hartley arranged for a meeting yesterday afternoon. "Confidential," he said. "Left instructions that the chamber be cleared. I obeyed, of course, though it was unusual for him to manage business without colleagues present." "And what hour was this?" Purbright inquired. 3:30 precisely. I remember looking at the clock. The council chamber door banged shut shortly after." Love blurted, "But Hartley was—" then checked himself under Purbright's calm gaze. The inspector merely asked, "And did you see Hartley himself go in?" Mr. Larkin shook his head. "Not directly. I heard his voice, speaking to someone already inside. Assumed it was him." "His voice," Purbright repeated thoughtfully, watching the man's expression. "Yes, voices are terribly obliging things. They'll say whatever you expect." Back outside, Love fussed with his notes. So there were two versions of him, the real councillor, stabbed at the flower show, and another Hartley, or someone close enough, walking into the council offices to attend a meeting that may or may not have been real. "Not necessarily two versions, Love," Purbright said, stepping carefully down the stone stairs. "There might be two accounts, which is not the same. One must ask who benefits if the councillor is believed alive when already dead." The sergeant frowned. "Wouldn't that depend on what business he had that day?" "Exactly, Love, and we must find it by noon." Their inquiries led them to the council meeting schedule posted on the town notice board. There had indeed been a committee session planned for that afternoon. The Committee for Developmental Proposals, at which Councillor Hartley was intended to present some document of considerable importance. Love scratched at his temple as he read. "Proposals, sir. That matches the scrap we found in the mayor's fireplace. Something burned with the ending possibilities, remember? Could be from these papers." Purbright gazed at the faded ink on the board where names were posted. It could. And if those documents were destroyed immediately after Hartley's death, instead of being presented, then there is someone on this committee who did not want them read aloud. The shadow of motive, faint the day before, began to darken. That afternoon they met with the town solicitor, who sighed heavily when asked to describe Hartley's proposals. He was preparing to speak against a number of questionable property developments, practices not entirely above board, if you understand me. There are some on the council who would have considered him a considerable nuisance. Would any of them, Purbright inquired with disarmingly calm curiosity, also own a silver watch chain? The solicitor blinked. The mayor always wears one, immensely proud of it. Love brightened as though the mystery had just been solved. Then that's it, sir. The mayor is first in line, the chain at the scene, the fire in his office, and naturally the motive. Purbright interrupted softly. So very tidy, Love. Almost too tidy. Love's penciled enthusiasm wilted slightly. He muttered, "Perhaps not the mayor, then." Purbright pocketed his notebook and gave the faintest of smiles. "It may very well be. But the neat path is sometimes the one kindly laid for us by whoever hopes to direct our tread." As dusk fell, the inspector once more stood with Love in the square, looking up at the stubbornly silent parish clock. A watch chain in the hall, a clock halted at 3:20, an apparent ghost entering council chambers at 3:30, and a proposal destined never to be heard. "Tell me, Love, which piece would you consider most important?" Love chewed his pencil, scowled at his own confusion, and finally admitted, "I'm afraid I don't know, sir." Purbright's eyes rested steadily on the frozen clock hands above them. "Neither do I. That, Sergeant, is why it is important." The lamplighter shuffled past with his long pole, pausing to stare up at the two policemen and their chosen monument. By now, Flaxborough's citizens were comfortably installed in parlors and pubs, whispering the newest variations of the day's gossip. And from somewhere in town, behind a firmly locked door, an unknown presence stirred, aware that the game had only just begun. The morning after their long vigils beneath the frozen parish clock brought with it a curious blend of solemnity and pageantry. Councillor Hartley, however awkwardly discovered, was still a civic dignitary, and the town was required to show respect. A special commemorative service had been arranged in the parish church, with various officials intent on exhibiting properly performed grief. In Flaxborough, grief was never performed without a program, a platform of speeches, and, ideally, a brass band. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love attended, less as mourners than as professional observers. The nave swelled with a congregation eager not to appear absent on such an occasion. There were clerks in stiff collars, matrons in black veils, and aldermen who wore funereal expressions that owed more to indigestion than to loss. At the front, the mayor, freshly polished chain across his waistcoat, sat with lugubrious magnificence. Before the vicar could begin, a whisper curved along the rows like a draught. The coffin had not yet arrived. It was still being carried gingerly across the churchyard, borne by 4 uneasy volunteers, selected less for musculature than for willingness. Their approach was sufficiently wobbly to invite speculation that Hartley would suffer a second indignity before reaching the chancel. The service proceeded only slightly less awkwardly than its beginning. Hymns were sung in the thin pitch of provincial piety. Select officials delivered tributes, each sounding suspiciously recycled from previous occasions. Hartley was praised as stalwart, respected, conscientious, though none ventured to call him universally liked. Then came the point designed to provide civic closure. the ceremonial announcement of a replacement councillor. In the smooth order of small-town governance, even death must not interrupt administration longer than a fortnight. The mayor rose, adjusting his chain, and cleared his throat to name the inheritor of Hartley's committee seat. Mrs. Eleanor Digby, he intoned, whose dedication to the borough and its progress is— He stopped abruptly. From the opposite aisle, another figure was also standing. Thin, bespectacled, with a surprisingly steady voice, the interloper declared, "No, Mr. Mayor, the appointment was Hartley's to propose, and propose it he did. I have here his letter, naming me as the successor." The congregation sighed collectively, the sound of scandal arriving in its favourite haunt. The man waving a folded document was none other than Councillor Fitch, a political rival known more for obstinacy than genius. The vicar murmured helplessly about order, but words collapsed under the spectacle that now unfolded. The mayor, visibly flustered, protested, "Nonsense!" There was no such letter, none deposited with the council. Fitch brandished the page stubbornly. "Because you destroyed it." The words struck like a badly tuned cymbal in the echoing church. Murmurs multiplied, heads craned. Purbright, seated unobtrusively halfway, back, narrowed his eyes. He rose slowly, walking forward along the aisle with the steady tread of someone accustomed to a cooling temper before it ignites. "Gentlemen," he said softly, though his tone pressed down more firmly than a raised hand, "perhaps we might treat this paper with the respect one owes to evidence. If Councillor Hartley committed this to parchment before his death, it would indeed be material to our inquiry, and if it is a forgery, then it is more material still." He requested the document. Fitch hesitated, though yielding eventually, with the reluctant gesture of one surrendering treasure to an unthanked official. Purbright handled it carefully. The letter appeared typed, but the signature scrawled at the bottom was curiously off. Stiff, overly neat, as though rehearsed. "Sergeant," Purbright murmured to Love. "Observe the ink. Still fresh enough to smudge." He closed the paper carefully again. The mayor's cheeks had flushed like beetroot. Fitch, triumphant, muttered loud enough for many to hear, "There." Proof Hartley's intentions outlived him. The inspector tucked the letter into his case without flourish. He let silence trickle through the church until the congregation realized no climax would be forthcoming, only renewed uncertainty. At last, the vicar resumed a hymn, attempting to drown gossip with tune. When the service ended and the crowd spilt into the churchyard, like seeds shaken from a pod, the questions began. Villagers circled around each other in knots, buzzing conjecture rising with the mist. The phrase, "forged letter," was already repeated with relish. Purbright and Love, stepping into the cool daylight, exchanged a few words at first. Love was the one to break the silence. If Fitch claims Hartley gave him that letter, then either he lies, or Hartley wrote it after he died, which is impossible. "Impossible in one sense," Purbright corrected gently, "but not impossible in another. Consider, someone wanted us to believe Hartley lived later than he did. An impersonation, remember. A letter might serve the same purpose." As they walked toward the police car, Love frowned. "But what does it gain anyone, sir? Hartley's dead, yet people strive to prove he was alive long enough to write letters, walk into council, hold meetings that nobody actually saw. What's to be achieved by pretending the man deferred his own funeral?" Purbright paused at the gate. "Precisely the question, Love. Until we know what business Hartley was prevented from presenting, we shall have to assume there are those who profit by shifting his death forward in time, if only on paper." Back at the station, the inspector examined the supposed letter more closely under good light. The typeface did not match the council's usual machine. The margin alignment was uneven, amateurish, and Hartley's signature, compared to samples obtained from the registrar's files, lacked his habitual loop at the H. It was not clumsy work, but it was imitation, They summoned Fitch for a private interview. The counsellor wriggled under questioning, alternating between arrogance and defensiveness. "Hartley spoke to me a fortnight ago," he insisted. "He mentioned naming me to succeed him. He must have written it down before the tragedy. Yet you produce it today, at a ceremonial service," Purbright observed steadily. "Not earlier when the investigation began. Why wait?" Fitch faltered. I thought the mayor might suppress it, so I waited until the town could see it plain." Purbright asked him to describe Hartley's words exactly, but Fitch's recollection proved foggy, more paraphrase than quotation. Eventually, the counsellor departed in a state of fluster, muttering about conspiracies against him. Love, when the door shut, harumphed. "He's guilty if ever I saw one. That letter's as false as a threepenny note." Purbright simply folded the document and returned it to its envelope. His face, calm as an undertaker's, gave nothing away. Perhaps love? Or perhaps we are meant to think exactly that. Consider how conveniently these point suspicion, even spectacle, in one direction. Love groaned. "So it's another misdirection?" "Quite possibly. Our puzzle, remember, is as much about when as about who. A forged letter not only says Fitch, it says Hartley was alive later than he was. Both could be significant." That evening, as dusk cloaked the square, Purbright stopped again below the parish clock. The hands still lingered at 3:20, unbending. Below that silent guardian, Flaxborough muttered about forged signatures, conspiracies and double dealings. And Purbright, gazing up into the gloom, murmured only to himself, "The clock measures no longer the hours, but the lies told to conceal them." The morning after the churchyard disorder found Inspector Purbright once more walked through the town before calling at the station. The square was calm, subdued even, though an undercurrent of chatter persisted wherever people clustered. The parish clock loomed above, unyielding in its stoppage, its hands never wavering from 3:20. Beneath it, Purbright's step was deliberate, his gaze soft and wandering, but his mind, as Love often suspected, frighteningly precise. Inside the police office, Sergeant Love was already sifting through a stack of messages that had accumulated overnight. "More witnesses, sir," he reported with a kind of bleak amazement. "Each more certain than the last, none in agreement. One fellow insists he passed Hartley in Market Street at 3:45. Another swears blind he saw the councillor's hat on a chair in the council lobby after tea." Purbright set down his umbrella and glanced over the pile. The more sightings of Hartley after his death, the less likely any of them occurred. Proliferation is the surest sign of imagination at play. He reached gently for one note and considered it longer than the rest. "But this one, Love, may have substance. The organist reports finding Hartley's gloves behind the hymn books last night. Curiously specific, wouldn't you say? Their visit to the church was made before the bell struck 10. The verger unlocked the vestry gloomily, muttering about scandal ruling over reverence. Indeed, on a narrow shelf behind the hymnals, a pair of gloves sat neatly folded. Soft leather, their lining faintly scented of tobacco. Purbright examined them without touching. The initials E.H. were pressed discreetly inside the wrist. Love frowned deeply. "Left here by mistake when Hartley came to church earlier in the week, perhaps." "Perhaps," Purbright answered slowly. "Or placed here deliberately, to be found precisely now." He gestured to the organ console. "Strange how objects belonging to Hartley appear in places he could not have visited alive after 3:20 yesterday. Each discovery extends his appearance, as though his ghost were retracing the rounds of civic duty." They departed with the gloves carefully wrapped, returning to the station only to be met by a constable breathless with news. "Sir, it's Councillor Fitch. He tried to pawn a watch last night, silver, without a chain. The shopkeeper thought it odd, knowing about the chain you found. He reported it straight away." Love reacted with delight. "There it is, sir. The mayor's chain was clean in his office, but Fitch had the watch. He must have dropped the chain in the hall himself. Purbright made no objection. Let us hear Fitch explain. His tone was not disbelief, but the even calm that made Love second-guess his own excitement. At the interview, Councillor Fitch blustered like a man clinging to reeds in rising water. "Nonsense! I did not pawn it. I only sought an appraisal for value. The watch was mine, a family heirloom, merely without its chain." His bluster carried a hollow clang, betraying nerves beneath the surface. When asked to produce proof of ownership, he failed convincingly poorly. No receipts, no family testimony reliable enough. The mayor, summoned discreetly, confirmed with smug solemnity that Hartley was known always to carry a silver chain and fob watch, as inseparable from him as his spectacles. It seemed, therefore, undeniable. Gossip ballooned, and more than gossip. Aldermen whispered sharply of Fitch's removal from council seat. Townsfolk exchanged certain nods, declaring guilt solved. In the pubs, patrons elevated pitchers with a flourish, exclaiming, "That Fitch fellow is the murderer. Plain enough. Had the watch, forged the letter, desperate to replace Hartley." Love, influenced by this chorus, muttered, "Isn't it clear, sir? He wanted Hartley's seat, forged the letter to prove it, and even had his watch. They'll hang him high." Purbright only asked, "And yet, Love, who truly gains by Fitch's disgrace? Be wary of guilt wrapped and presented with such ornament. The neat parcel often hides an emptier box inside. If Fitch is indeed our man, why strew Hartley's belongings like breadcrumbs across the town? Why place gloves in church, chain in hall, watch at pawn? Murderers prefer concealment, not advertisement." Nevertheless, the procedure required Fitch's detention. The councillor spent the night in the cell, protesting his innocence loudly enough to reach the front desk. From every chimney in Flaxborough, the smoke of certainty rose. The case, to neighbours, was as good as done. Yet that evening, Purbright walked alone to the square again. He stood still a long time, gazing up at the silent clock tower until stars pricked out above. The town around him seemed already to settle back into routine, content that the scandal was enclosed by iron bars. Only he sensed otherwise. That night, the peace broke anew. A junior clerk from the development committee hurried pale-faced to the station. "Inspector," he stammered, "I stayed late at the offices this evening, balancing accounts as ordered. On leaving, I passed the notice board in the lobby. Something pinned there. It took my breath. A note, in Hartley's handwriting. His true hand. Dated yesterday evening, marked after the death." The paper he produced shook between his fingers. Instantly recognizable to Purbright was the very loop in the H that the forged letter had lacked. The note was brief but unmistakable. Meeting adjourned. Proposals delayed until next week. E.H. Love stared aghast. But that means Hartley alive after he was murdered, or somebody skilled enough to imitate his very stroke of hand. Indeed, Love. Purbright's eyelids lowered, concealing the exact contents of his thought. The appearance of a ghost grows ever more diligent. While Councillor Fitch languishes, another hand grows busy. Either the dead have learned the art of adjournment, or among the living stands one with talents we have underestimated. The revelation struck like a bell in an empty night. Gossip of Fitch's guilt would falter when this new proof seeped into the taverns. The soil beneath the false trail began to crumble, and Purbright knew they had barely tired the devil who spun it. He turned the folded paper thoughtfully, his mild voice almost lost to the hum of darkness. The more convincingly Hartley is made to live, the more certain it is someone desired him very much to die. By the time word of Hartley's supposed handwriting reached the streets, Flaxborough was again seething with argument. Fitch's arrest, which had seemed tidy, now appeared premature. The supposedly forged letter he had flourished in church looked amateur compared to the crisp authenticity of the new note. Where one trailed suspicion, the other bore irresistible conviction. The townsfolk had at once begun to murmur the more thrilling, that Hartley himself had been seen, had written, had perhaps only fainted at the show and returned mysteriously alive. Inspector Purbright listened to this muddle without visible irritation. He walked with Sergeant Love through the cobbled square, hands folded behind his back as though taking an evening stroll rather than investigating a crime. "You observe, Love," he said, "how quickly a community accepts contradiction if the contradiction seems more delightful. Hartley, by dying and then refusing to quit staying dead, has given the town more conversation than a decade of ordinary living could achieve." Love scratched under his cap. "But, sir, that note, if it truly was in his hand, then he was alive after his death." "Impossible. You are perfectly right to call it that." Purbright's voice remained gentle. "Yet impossibility has a wicked talent for getting its bills paid, which means either Hartley lived beyond his murder or someone has contrived this handwriting very faithfully. And handwriting, Love, is more easily borrowed than life." They turned into the long aisle of the parish church, summoned there by the verger, who had asked nervously for the inspector's presence. He led them to the chancel, whispering, "I daren't say it aloud. It'll sound uncanny. But this morning, when I set out the hymn numbers, I found them already changed in the night, laid out as if for yesterday afternoon, but in a peculiar fashion. Look there, 3-20-period. The wooden boards presented 3 digits not corresponding to any hymn in the book. They matched instead the precise stopping place of the great clock outside. 3:20. Not a parishioner in the village now failed to know that time. Love's eyes goggled. But surely no ordinary choir boy or sacristan would make that number. It looks deliberate. "Sir, are we to suppose—" "We are to suppose nothing," Purbright interrupted mildly. He reached up, touched the card gently, then returned it to its place. "Only note that someone has contrived to write Hartley's life in objects. The gloves in the vestry, the chain in the hall, the watch in Fitch's hand, the note on the board. Each tells the same story, a man who lived longer than he did. And now, even heaven's own hymn tells it. Rather industrious work for a ghost." The verger was pale. It could be the young lads, Inspector. Mischievous lots, hearing too much rumour." "It could indeed," Purbright allowed. "Yet mischief and murder seldom dance hand in hand. No, this is tidier than mischief. Tidier and rather proud, I think." That afternoon, Purbright had the handwriting note examined by an expert in a neighbouring town. The opinion came back promptly. Authentic. So authentic, in fact, that any forgery must have required dedication, imitation, and long study, which narrowed the likely candidates from the careless to the few who had occasion to study Hartley's correspondences intimately. Clerks, colleagues, and, naturally, family. Mrs. Hartley received them a second time with a cooler welcome. She wore black without adornment, standing like a portrait that had grown flesh. Purbright asked gently if she recognized the note found upon the council board. Her eyes moved across the paper, and her lips pressed thin. "Yes, it is his hand. I would know it from 1,000 samples." Love leaned forward. "Then you believe he's written it after—" He faltered under Purbright's discreet cough. Mrs. Hartley continued rather than answered. "My husband kept many letters, committee drafts and minutes. His hand is everywhere in those cabinets. Any clever soul might practice upon them." "Did he keep those papers at home, madam?" Purbright asked softly. "In his study, but the house has been locked since yesterday morning." She looked away as though from something painful. Unless someone had keys." Love murmured darkly. "There we are, sir." "Keys, study, practice papers. Could be someone in the family. Forgiveness, madam, but do you, or your servants—" Mrs. Hartley's voice sharpened like a blade. "I will not have Edgar's family thrown into sordid suspicion, Sergeant. If you require his cabinets, they're at the house. You may draw your own conclusions. Back outside, Love muttered. Could be her herself, sir. She sounded tense. Purbright's brows drifted toward amusement. A widow whose husband is found among vegetables may perhaps be allowed a touch of tension. While the suspicion fastened loudly upon Fitch in the town, Purbright's thoughts trailed elsewhere. At dusk, he walked again along the square and into the council building. Corridors now seemed stretched by shadows. Upon a notice board near the chamber, another edition had been pinned in clumsy haste. A scrap of paper with only 2 numbers, 3 and 30, scribbled upon it. Love, staring, gasped. It's the new hour, sir. Whoever plays games now claims Hartley alive at 3:30 again, 15 minutes after. Purbright, instead of answering, plucked the slip carefully. They advanced the ghost with each day, first till 3:30, then till evening, then till adjournment. Each insertion prolongs him. One wonders how late Hartley is predicted to live before the tale grows dull. That night proved anything but dull. For just after midnight, the town bandmaster, drunkenly leaving the pub, swore he saw Councillor Hartley himself, standing by the clock tower, hat tipped, briefcase in hand. The next morning, half the town repeated it, the story already fattened by imagination. The man's ghost walked, they said. Others insisted it must be Hartley, never dead at all. Through it all, Purbright remained the picture of composure. The more appearances Hartley makes, he remarked to Love as they stood again beneath the clock, the less he resembles himself. Each sighting is a step further from the truth. Someone is building a man from scraps, not letting him lie buried. And sooner or later, Love, those scraps will form a figure we shall be able to identify, not of Hartley, but of the hand conducting this puppet. Love rubbed his chin. Until then, we keep Fitch in the cell. Purbright cast him a side glance, almost solemn in its mildness. Fitch is no threat to anyone at present, except perhaps his solicitor. No, the true enemy is still arranging hymn numbers, scribbling letters, and making Hartley walk about at ungodly hours. He paused, then added, but they miscalculated, Love. A murderer may stab successfully, but impersonation is far trickier. Eventually, the mask slides. While Flaxborough seethed happily in scandal, gossip mounting higher than its rooftops, Purbright allowed himself the smallest of rare sighs. Each new flourish of Hartley's ghost narrowed, not widened, the circle of suspects. And as he looked once more at the frozen clock and remembered the hymn-board digits, he murmured in a voice softer than the town's slumber. A clock may be forced to stop, but time, it insists regardless. Let us see who runs out of it first. By the following day, Flaxborough had ceased to discuss whether Councillor Hartley was dead, and had instead settled into a far livelier debate over how long he'd been permitted to live after his own death. Pub corners brimmed with armchair coroners, declaring that he had staggered about wounded for hours. Shopkeepers claimed with relish that the man had enjoyed a last walkabout to haunt his critics. To them, death was not an event, but a performance, and Hartley had become not a victim, but a spectacle. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, walked quietly through this theatre of contradiction, never rebuking, never encouraging, merely listening as though each absurdity was another stone in his careful arrangements. Beside him, Sergeant Love was less composed, recording each tale with frowning irritation. Half the town has gone daft, sir. We've 12 sightings at 4 o'clock, 8 insisting on 5, and 2 claiming he boarded the 6:15 bus. Truth, Love, Purbright remarked as they approached the town hall, is rather like light through a stained glass window. Many colors, same source. These fantasies amuse, but each contains the faint outline of design. The design is worth our notice. The colors may be discarded. That afternoon, the council chamber was to host a public forum, ostensibly to calm the restless parish with open statements. Though designed to diffuse gossip, it instead promised to fertilize it spectacularly. Every notable of Flaxborough gathered there, with townsfolk packed along the benches for morsels of scandal. Purbright and Love entered quietly, but the ripple that accompanied their arrival suggested curiosity weighed heavily toward them as arbiters of truth. The mayor rose ponderously, his chain gleaming, cheeks flushed as though still scorched from Fitch's antics in the church. "My friends," he began, "it grieves us all to lose Councillor Hartley, but it is our duty to maintain order, to continue business, and not become prey to disruptive lies." His eyes flickered toward Fitch, who sat glum behind two solicitors, still protesting innocence of both forgery and thievery. Then, just as the mayor reached his solemn reassurance, there was a rustle at the chamber's rear. A boy hurried forward, clutching a folded envelope. He handed it directly to the chair before whispering something urgent. The mayor's hand trembled as he opened it. A single page emerged, typed again, though now more carefully produced. And once again, at the bottom, Hartley's signature scrawled with unarguable authenticity. Murmurs swelled like an approaching storm. The mayor, complexion shifting between rage and panic, read, "Councillor Fitch to succeed me on the Committee for Developmental Proposals. Proposals to be deferred until next month. E.H." An audible gasp cracked the chamber. Fitch sprang to his feet, exclaiming, There you see it, his true will." His solicitors nodded with tragic solemnity. The mayor sputtered denial, calling it fraud. Love leaned toward Purbright, whispering breathlessly, "This clears him, doesn't it, sir?" It shows Hartley really meant Fitch after all. Purbright remained calm, expression unreadable. "It shows us only what someone wants very badly for us to believe," he murmured. The chamber dissolved into uproar. Councillor after councillor cried motives against one another. One declared Hartley had threatened to expose shady property dealings near the railway. Another shouted that the mayor's accounts required investigation, else the borough would discover funds diverted to private schemes. Women in the gallery whispered of assignations in vestries, of Hartley's supposed affairs. The word murderer clung suddenly to half a dozen names. Seizing the moment, Purbright stood when the noise had swollen to a peak. He did not shout, but his mild voice carried better for its lack of effort. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may relieve you of one certainty, whoever brings these papers, these notes, these signatures, is the same hand. The documents may appear authentic, but they exist to prolong Hartley's presence after death, and by that prolongation, to obscure the truth. The murderer is among you, yes, but it is not proven by a paper. Rather, it will be betrayed by inconsistency, and I assure you, inconsistency leaves fingerprints." Whispers stilled, though tension vibrated like an organ cord held too long. The mayor sagged back down. Fitch smiled like a man reprieved, and half the councillors left pale and uncertain. When the chamber emptied, Love shook his head. "Sir, that felt like a baiting circus. But still, wasn't the letter convincing? Whoever wrote it has made poor Fitch an accidental victim." "Quite the reverse, Love," Purbright answered, glancing at the fireplace where yet another small ash heap smouldered incongruously below a clean grate. He walked to it, stirred once with his pencil, and retrieved a scrap. "Among the remains here lies another copy, half-burned, misaligned by its typist. Someone practiced again, only this draft was spoiled. See, Fitch is named here also. Too desperate, too eager. Our murderer abhors silence." Love bent beside him, brow furrowing. "But this points back to Fitch himself. Who else could be so eager he'd bungled a draft and left it in plain sight?" Purbright slipstreamed past the suggestion with a faint smile. "Unless, Love, someone wants us to think precisely that. Consider, if Fitch is guilty, why produce paper after paper, only to risk discovery in fires and notice boards? No, this reeks of a designer who requires Fitch in our thoughts, not in the truth. Evening closed quickly over Flaxborough. Outside, the square grew restless as the crowd dissected each moment of the meeting, repeating each cry and gasp with embellishment. The parish clock looked down, its stillness mocking the confusion below. Purbright and Love returned to the police station, where Fitch remained reluctantly detained. The councillor bristled. "You see it now, Inspector. Hartley named me. He intended me all along. Release me at once." Purbright, very mild, asked only, "Councillor, who knew of Hartley's intention to speak against the developments? You, the mayor, others of your committee?" Fitch sneered. Everyone knew. He was noisy enough about it. Letters circulated, speeches drafted. He was about to ruin a number of comfortable arrangements. "Comfortable arrangements," Purbright repeated softly. He leaned slightly closer. "Then perhaps, Councillor, you may yet understand that a forged blessing can be as deadly as an open denunciation. You are not clear of the shadow yet." When Fitch began to rage again, Purbright left him to his solicitor's soothings. Out in the corridor, Love exhaled noisily. "I'm lost, sir. If not Fitch, then who's left? The mayor with his chain, or Hartley's own wife with access to his papers, or one of those councilmen he threatened?" "Precisely so, Love," Purbright said, adjusting his hat. "And the careful scattering of Hartley's belongings serves to oblige us to chase them all. But our enemy has erred, a hand too eager, a fire too hasty, a string of appearances already too long. Patience will show the mask slip." At that moment, a messenger hurried in with a new alarm. Someone had vandalized the parish notice board outside the church, the hymn cards again rearranged, but not to 320. This time, the displayed digits were stark and deliberate. 4-00. Love's mouth fell open. "They're advancing him further, sir. Now Hartley's meant to have lived until 4 on the dot." Purbright stared out into the cold dusk, where the vagrant flicker of lamplight fell upon the old boards. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and his voice, calm and grave, gave only, "Then tomorrow, Love, expect another hour scrawled, until our ghost overspends his credit. Fakes grow weaker with repetition. By advancing his time, our murderer brings forward his own appointment." And with the parish clock still marking 3:20, unbending to all fabrications, Purbright turned toward the night as if listening for the breath of the true culprit, aware now that the next move would be decisive. The figures 400 lingered on the hymn board like graffiti against sanctity. By morning, every parishioner had passed beneath and speculated on what it meant. For most, the answer was delicious. Hartley had lived, perhaps until tea, perhaps long enough to curse his enemies before collapsing. For Inspector Purbright, the answer was troublingly simpler. Someone was manufacturing the ghost with clockwork diligence, turning Hartley into a puppet of after-hours existence. While the town squabbled merrily over interpretations, Purbright's interest turned from speculation toward motives, specifically the living hearts behind the shadows. Murder was never committed by apparitions. It required flesh, grievance, and sometimes affection soured into its opposite. He began with the mayor, a man whom Flaxborough both mocked and deferred to. Summoned for questioning, the mayor arrived swathed in his chain, as though it lent both authority and innocence. His chair creaked beneath him as he sat in Purbright's office, complexion florid from indignation. "This nonsense about papers and letters is undermining the civic order, Inspector," the mayor grumbled. "If it continues, I shall insist on restitution. My good name is dragged with these ashes in my grate. It was an accident. Any burnt scraps resembled documents, I assure you." Purbright's smile remained tranquil. "Possibly. Tell me, Mr. Mayor, what interest had you in the proposals Hartley intended to present?" The mayor sniffed ponderously. "Interest?" He was blocking progress. "I do not deny it. Those housing schemes would have brought employment and prosperity. Hartley was always obstructing, wagging papers like a schoolmaster. But opposition, Inspector, is no crime. Purbright regarded him in silence, long enough that colour mottled further across the mayor's cheeks. Finally, in a voice gentler still, he replied, "But obstruction, sir, is a nuisance to those who profit. The difference between nuisance and crime is occasionally a matter of patience." When the mayor departed in a swirl of affront, Love muttered grimly, "He all but admitted his motive. Think it's him, sir." "Think less, Love," Purbright corrected kindly. "Observe more. Anger is no proof. Sometimes it merely clouds innocence." Their next call was to Mrs. Hartley again. She received them in her quiet parlour, though her silence was brittle rather than welcoming. The widow sat with folded hands as though restraining tremors. Purbright asked cautiously if her husband had any enemies in private life rather than public. "Enemies," she said at length, "he collected with as much regularity as minutes of meetings, yet the sharper wound did not come from councils or aldermen, Inspector." Her gaze faltered toward the mantelpiece photograph of a young woman, her sister, as Purbright knew from the registry. She hesitated but did not withdraw. "My husband pursued attachments. I forbade none, for I held marriage as a duty rather than a comfort. But affection unbalanced can breed more danger than civic quarrel." Love shifted awkwardly, ears reddening. Purbright's tone remained even. "Are you suggesting one such attachment may have played a part in his end?" Mrs. Hartley's mouth pinched. "Attachments inspire jealousy. Jealousy, rash deeds. I cannot be your judge, Inspector. Only his widow." When they took their leave, Love whispered anxiously, "Do you think she hints at someone particular?" "No names, Love, but perhaps a path. Desire is as strong a driver as profit. One stabs for money, another for love denied. Both metal pierces equally." This led them, by discreet inquiries, toward Miss Eleanor Digby, the very woman the mayor had announced as Hartley's intended replacement at the church, before Fitch had interrupted with his document. Miss Digby lived alone in a tidy terrace filled with faint scents of perfume and neglected books. She received them with an unexpected composure. "Inspector, Sergeant, I had a long association with Edgar. He confided political matters. Yes, sometimes social. But you suggest impropriety, and I object. Hartley held me in esteem, not in secret." Her voice was firm, though her hands toyed ceaselessly with a handkerchief. Purbright observed gently, "He intended you as successor to his committee seat, a gesture of confidence, certainly. Might you describe in what manner he prepared you?" Miss Digby flushed faintly but lifted her chin. "He advised me, lent documents, that is all. I required none other's blessing. My record stands on its own." "And yet," Purbright said almost kindly, "the papers suggest otherwise. One naming Fitch, another the mayor suspected of pyres, others anonymous. Each point is in a different direction. You see, Miss Digby, murder does not merely end life. It scrambles intention." Her eyes glistened. "If you mean jealousy, Inspector, know that I loved him. But I did not kill him. His enemies are elsewhere." When they stepped back into the street, Love muttered, "Another guilty look if ever I saw one. She contradicts herself. In love, but denies attachment. His successor, but disowns ambition. She feels entangled." Purbright paused, surveying the street's quiet shop fronts. "Possibly entangled, Love, but confession shunned at the edge of tears often hides grief, not guilt. Still, her name joins the ledger." Evening deepened, and with it came fresh stirrings. Purbright heard reports that the bandmaster, who had sworn to see Hartley alive by the tower, had recanted stiffly under quiet questioning. Pressed too far, he admitted he had been encouraged. Some unnamed gentleman had suggested it loudly in the pub before paying his account. Liquor and suggestion had transformed into testimony by midnight. The inspector considered this calmly. A ghost who requires bribes to appear is a poor spectre indeed. Love asked, "Then do we trace the money?" Indeed, though money leaves shallower trails than affection or anger. Still, we shall find whose purse grows lighter. Late that night, Purbright sat silently in his office, studying the scraps, gloves folded in vestry, watch without chain, handwriting flawless, hymn boards declaring nonsense numbers, testimony purchased with ale. Each construction more elaborate than the next, he murmured softly, though Love, dozing opposite, scarcely heard. They wish us exhausted by possibilities until truth itself seems one more forgery. But endurance, Love, is the only tool that does not grow counterfeit. The parish clock, outside and unswayed, still bore its mute evidence of 3:20. Chilled night air crept beneath the sill. Somewhere in the town, the murderer had watched the uproar of council, noted the discord of hearts, and for reasons not yet laid plain, smiled at how well Hartley still served a role, even from beneath his coffin's lid. For Purbright, the next step was not more gossip, but character, probing hearts that concealed more than their words admitted. And he knew dawn would bring him closer, for daylight always showed where masks had worn thin. The next morning carried with it the brisk bite of wind off the fields, crisp enough to sting the skin, but it was hardly strong enough to cool the warmth of scandal still baking across Flaxborough. Everywhere Purbright and Love walked, housewives leaned over gates to exchange newly embroidered variations of Hartley's fate, while councillors skulked down side lanes rather than risk being waylaid by fervid accusers. The parish clock's constancy at 3:20 mocked the whole community. Though Flaxborough insisted on prolonging Hartley's life, the very clock that had presided over his collapse would never acknowledge a minute beyond the fatal one. But the town's good sense was about to be tested further, for that evening a formal council meeting had been scheduled, ostensibly to replace Hartley on key committees and move borough business forward. Knowing the appetite of the crowd, however, Purbright regarded it as less a proceeding than a theatre piece, and one which the culprit, still among them, could not resist manipulating. The meeting chamber was packed by twilight, with the public gallery straining under the weight of citizens hungry for their next ration of drama. Along the table of councillors sat the mayor in crimson indignation, Fitch still, ruddy with his mix of panic and glee. Miss Digby stooped over her notes like a chastened student, and half a dozen others who eyed one another as conspirators trapped at the same banquet. The mayor struck his gavel with showy force. "Order, order. We are here to address vacancies. Not speculation, not gossip. I refuse another descent into theatrics as at the church." At exactly that moment, the chamber door opened. A constable entered late, carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper bound with string. He handed it across to Purbright, under the gaze of every curious face. Purbright, inscrutable, undid the wrapping. Within lay another document folder, typed minutes but loose and hurried, bearing Hartley's unmistakable looping signature at the bottom. The room roared. Someone shouted, "Another one!" Someone else exclaimed, "How many times can a dead man attend meetings?" Fitch leapt half upright, proclaiming, "Proof again!" He intended me all along, and slapped the oak desk with a hand of triumph. Purbright raised his palm. His voice was quiet, but the hush that followed bent every ear toward him. "Ladies and gentlemen, this newest paper purports to be minutes dictated yesterday. They commend certain developments Hartley opposed in life, without correction, without dissent. You might observe, as I do, how curious it is that in death a man alters his mind so thoroughly." He closed the folder slowly. A ripple shivered across the councillors. Some blanched, some muttered shameful denials. The mayor barked, "Forgery!" only for Fitch to howl back, "Authenticity!" and Miss Digby to murmur, "Then his opposition meant nothing." Love leaned close to Purbright's shoulder. But, sir, if that's genuine writing, then Hartley betrayed his own cause, or else the culprit perfects their imitation. Purbright did not reply at first, but studied each counsellor's face as if listening not to their words, but to their silences. At last, he observed, almost like commentary to himself, the ghost is becoming reckless. The more one forces Hartley to speak from his grave, the less credible his voice sounds. Soon even the town's gossip will tire of so busy a spirit. The mayor attempted to reclaim authority. This chamber cannot be turned into a puppet stage for phantom documents. We must resolve the business. But he was drowned by jeering from the gallery, who had tasted blood, or at least drama, and were not inclined to return to routine. Then, just as shouting peaked, sudden chaos vibrated through the chamber. The great clock above the hall, a sister mechanism to the Parish Tower outside, let out a groan and abruptly advanced. Its hands, frozen since the afternoon of murder, lurched forward in a violent spasm, landing with a crash against 4 o'clock. The sound reverberated across stone walls, startling councillors to their feet. The crowd shrieked as one voice. Women clutched rosaries. Men swore loudly. "Hartley! He walks!" cried a voice giddy with terror. Love, startled, looked to Purbright. "It's the same hour they put on the hymn board, sir. 4 o'clock, exactly that." Purbright, though, remained unmoved, eyes narrowing minutely as though the sudden motion of iron in the clockwork had confirmed something deeply anticipated. He whispered, just loud enough for Love, and at last the mask begins to slip. Once calm was coaxed back by constables, the crowd expelled reluctantly into the night, still buzzing with ghost-fearing excitement. Inside the chamber, Purbright remained behind, bending once more over the clock mechanism with the caretaker. The man stammered, "It was tampered with, Inspector." "There. Wire strained here, gear forced. Someone wound it secretly, then released it at the moment to act, like a stage trick." Love, pale, muttered, "So it's no ghost. It's another clue planted. But why that exact time again? Why 4 o'clock? Purbright answered almost gently. "Because, Love, our murderer values symbolism above subtlety. They needed the town to believe Hartley remained alive till 4. But in forcing even the clockwork to corroborate, they revealed knowledge deeper than rumor. Few would dare climb that tower. Fewer could adjust its frame unseen." Love swallowed. "Then we'll know our man by who has access to the clocks. Caretakers, vergers, perhaps council engineers." Purbright let the words float. "Access, certainly, but also patience, boldness, and a desire for theatre. Not just anyone tampers with the very clock that ordains the town's sense of order. Only someone whose life, perhaps, has involved performing roles for others to see." They left the chamber in silence. Outside, Flaxborough Square throbbed with wild conjecture. Children shrieked of Hartley's hand still on the dials. Women declared his spirit demanded justice. Men argued he had sworn vengeance. Yet above their voices, the clock now proclaimed a false hour, its truth corrupted by mortal fingers, and Purbright alone gazed at it with the calmness of one who discerned design, not accident. Back at the station, Love at last exhaled heavily. "I don't envy you, sir. Too many names, too many motives. Every time we corner the matter, it sprouts new heads. But if you truly think the clock stunt was planted, then surely the performer can't resist one show too many. That'll be their undoing." Purbright set his hat on the desk with quiet precision and replied, "Yes, Love. Puppeteers delight in spectacle, and as audiences grow hungry, the performance must swell, until the strings tangle and the figure collapses. Our murderer builds toward just such a collapse." He allowed himself a long pause, eyes resting lightly on the envelope of fake papers beside him. "When that moment arrives, we must not be dazzled like the crowd. We must watch the hand, not the puppet. And then, Sergeant, the ghost of Councillor, Hartley will at last be freed of this charade." Flaxborough woke the next day to find itself recounting the miracle of the clock. Every doorstep echoed with exclamations. Hartley had struck the hours himself. Hartley had commanded the gears with ghostly hands. Hartley had announced his own afterlife survival, more convincingly than any preacher's sermon could describe heaven. Pub cellars rang with laughter and terror in equal measure, and matrons hurried messages across streets to ensure no variation of the story went untold. What had begun as a murder was already swelling into legend. Inspector Purbright sat quietly in his station office while this drama grew louder outside his window. In his lap lay not the gossip, but the plain facts stripped bare. A body among marrows pierced at 3:20, a silver watch chain without its watch, gloves neatly folded in vestry, letters that multiplied like rabbits, anecdotes bought with ale, and at last gears forced in the great clock tower to tell a time unmoving except by hand. Each flourish extended Hartley's life further into impossible minutes. Purbright's calm was not indifference, but a deliberate act of resistance to theatre. He would not chase shades. Sergeant Love was less tranquil. "Sir, last night alone, 2 separate townsfolk swore they heard Hartley's voice on the telephone. At least one insisted he took a call for property valuations at 4:30. That's after the clock moved, mind you." His notebook flapped under his hand like a trapped bird. Purbright lifted his eyes. "And did Hartley also attend supper while they spoke, perhaps addressing 3 tables at once?" Love flushed. "Point taken. But there are too many moving pieces now. Somebody's orchestrating a pantomime, yet we keep letting them write the script." The inspector folded his hands. "And like an amateur playwright, Love, our culprit, will demand too many acts. Audiences tire. Every new appearance weakens the last. The trick lies not in how lifelike the ghost becomes, but in how obvious its puppeteer will be when the strings finally tangle." The moment of tangle arrived sooner than expected. That afternoon, another letter appeared, pinned boldly on the outer door of the council building. It was longer than the other scraps, almost a page and a half of directives supposedly from Hartley, detailing which councillor should succeed where, and in a flourish of utter absurdity, signing off with the words, "Time remains my ally, for I write still, though others wish me silent." The public devoured it. The crowd that formed outside the council offices read aloud, argued, squabbled, and even prayed. Love nearly tore his hair out. Now we've a Hartley who admits he writes after death, as if he'd sign off like some stage magician whispering from beyond. Purbright examined the script with his customary serenity. "Observe carefully. The longer the letter, the more cracks we discover. The hand is practiced, yes, but humility has fled. This Hartley writes with pomp that Hartley never possessed. Ego blossoms as the forger tires of restraint." The uproar forced the mayor to summon an emergency meeting in the town hall that same evening. Half Flaxborough queued to watch. The chamber quivered with anticipation, and indeed, the unseen hand behind the ghost provided one last grand illusion. At the meeting's height, as voices collided, accusations against Fitch, denials from the mayor, whisperings about Miss Digby, a lantern outside the chamber window flared to sudden brilliance. Against the frosted glass, a shadow moved, tall, stooped, unmistakable in outline. It was Hartley's very figure, carrying a briefcase and pausing as if to perch upon his favored seat. Gasps broke the room in half. Shrill voices cried, there he is." Men stumbled back, women crossed themselves. Love froze, mouth open. "Sir, it looks exactly—" Purbright merely closed his eyes for the length of a single breath. Then he rose, unhurried, and walked to the window. 2 constables followed, pushing through the knotting crowd into the courtyard beyond. Minutes later, they returned carrying not a resurrected councillor, but a wooden cut-out effigy, painted roughly, with a lantern positioned to throw its precise shadow against the glass. The sight silenced even the giddiest gossipers. Purbright addressed the council. voice calmer than the still clock above them. Here, ladies and gentlemen, is your last illusion. A puppet of light, a mannequin of presence. Councillor Hartley remains in his coffin, as he has these several days. Someone among you thought to perform one more act, to keep him walking until suspicion split into nonsense. Instead, they have shown us their theatre, and I assure you, I've watched the curtain rise long enough to know the hand behind it. He said no more, for explanations could wait. Calmly, he closed his notebook, refusing to deliver the satisfaction of names and motives to the crowd's hungry ears until proof was ready to accompany them. But in Love's staring face, Purbright read the echo of his own thought. They had reached the final misdirection. What remained now was not to swat at illusions, but to draw the curtain fully, expose the actor in disguise, and let the town's drama return to truth. As the crowd emptied in confused murmurs, equally disappointed and relieved, the effigy remained on the table. Mockingly, lifeless, paint already flaking, its shadow gone for good. The parish clock, unmoving still at its eternal 3:20, possessed more honesty than all the counterfeit Hartleys paraded since. Later, walking back across the square, Love said softly, "So this was it, the last trick. Whoever staged it is near desperate. They risked too much." Purbright nodded once, his expression unreadable. Desperation always shows in theatre, Love. When a performance is too eager to convince, the mask must crack, and tomorrow we collect the fragments, for the murderer has rehearsed too many roles, and now the stage is emptying. Above their heads, the stars blinked out one by one among cold clouds, and the town of Flaxborough, its gossip momentarily hushed, waited in uneasy silence for Purbright's unveiling. The wooden effigy with its lantern trick had been dragged from the council chamber and set in the evidence room like some dismal carnival prize. Outside, the town still muttered, caught between laughter at its own gullibility and nervous protestations that it had really seen a spirit. But in Inspector Purbright's mind, the case, for all its baroque theatrics, had narrowed to the simplest of principles. Murder had been committed, and every illusion since had been only to disguise the moment of its commission. That night, he allowed Sergeant Love to sleep a little while in the office chair. Alone, Purbright returned to his notes. His pencil underlined only 3 details. The clock stopped at 3:20, the papers threatening the development schemes, and the victim discovered among vegetables with a look of mild surprise. The rest, the voices, the gloves, the watch chain, the letters, the mannequin, were embellishments, bright cloth over darker wood. Morning, when it came, was grey and reluctant. Purbright summoned every councillor, the mayor, Fitch, Mrs. Hartley, Miss Digby, and a handful of clerks to the parish hall where the flower show had first descended into scandal. The vegetables were gone, the bunting stripped, but the echo of that first gasp seemed still to hang in the air. The townsfolk pressed against doors and windows, demanding entry, but Purbright had chosen privacy. Murder thrived in noise. It should be ended in silence. They gathered about him uneasily, Fitch glowering, the mayor fuming, Mrs. Hartley pale and stiff, Miss Digby anxious. Love stood beside Purbright, pencil quivering, eyes darting from one suspect to another, as if hoping the guilty would sprout horns. Purbright began quietly, almost like a man giving Sunday announcements. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have been much entertained these past days. Councillor Hartley has walked, written, sung hymns at curious numbers, even stood against frosted glass. Each trick was designed not to reveal his murderer, but to delay our asking who stabbed him at 3:20 by the Marrows. Today we dispense with spectacles." The mayor bristled. "Then let us hear names, Inspector. The borough has been made a laughing-stock." Purbright inclined his head courteously. "Very well. Councillor Hartley was killed because he stood poised to expose corrupt developments in the borough. Proposals already documented threatened to ruin certain men. Someone decided that the simplest cure was his death. But murder is not simple. To kill him solved one problem and created another. The question of timing. He died before 3:30, yet there was a meeting he was scheduled to attend after. If he were absent, his allies might grow suspicious immediately. His voice had to be heard a little longer, his presence extended beyond his corpse. Therefore, a ghost was manufactured. Objects placed where he could never have left them, letters scrawled in practiced hands, even the very parish clock forced forward to suit the fiction. Murmurs rippled among them. Mrs. Hartley closed her eyes briefly as one anticipating pain. Fitch gave a strangled laugh. "And who, pray, has the patience to build such nonsense? I suffered in your cells, Inspector. Was that not humiliation enough?" Purbright's gaze fell gently upon him. "Indeed, Councillor Fitch, you suffered, but you are no performer. Your bungling of the watch belonged more to desperation than design. The hand here is more precise, theatrical, and most of all obsessed with time." Love whispered, "Time. The clock again, sir." Purbright continued, his voice so mild that each leaned closer to hear. "One of you had both obsession and access. One who lingered about engines and mechanisms, who knew old gears from long familiarity. The very man who tended both the church hymn board and the clock faces. Our verger." A gasp escaped Miss Digby before silence clamped again. All heads turned toward the pale, trembling figure at the edge of the company. The verger, thin-shouldered and sweating, hands twitching as if already caught turning hymn cards. Purbright moved closer, voice steady as iron veiled in velvet. "You placed Hartley's gloves in the vestry. You adjusted the hymn board to read his hour. You bribed testimony with ale. You lit the effigy's lantern. But most revealing, you forced the clock itself, leaving scratches visible to any eye that desired to see. You did all this, not for amusement, but because Hartley threatened developments in which your family, through shell names, had heavy investments. Exposed, you would be ruined. Dead, Hartley could reveal nothing. Alive in appearance, his absence at council drew no suspicion until you could burn the offending papers." The verger stammered. I watched over the church only. What cause have I?" "You had cause enough," Purbright said softly. "The land beneath the old railway yard, intended for development, stood in your brother-in-law's name. Councillor Hartley learned the connection and meant to declare it. You panicked. You stabbed him here at the show, then hurried to lengthen his shadow. But each attempt, the chain, the watch, the notes, betrayed artistry too eager, too consistent. Murder is plain work. You painted it in colors too bright." For a moment, the hall quivered with silence. Then the verger collapsed against a chair, his muttered denials unraveling into sobs. Fitch swore softly. The mayor dabbed his brow. Mrs. Hartley turned her face away, unmoving. Love, almost forgetting himself, whispered in astonishment. The verger? "I'd never have guessed." Purbright's reply was almost tender. "That, love, is the point of disguises. Yet even the best, when worn too long, tear at the seams." The constables removed the broken man quietly. When the doors opened, the crowd surged like a tide for names and explanations. They learned only the simplest. Hartley had been avenged. Illusions had ended. The parish clock would be mended to strike true again. Later that evening, as twilight purpled the sky, Purbright and Love stood once more beneath that same clock. Its hands still pointed immovably at 3:20, stubborn witness to a death and to lies piled upon it. Love asked gently, "Will you have it set right, sir?" Purbright looked thoughtful. "Yes, love, but perhaps not at once. There is merit in a pause, a reminder to Flaxborough that time cannot be so easily pushed ahead by wish or trickery. Let them see 3:20 while gossip fades. When they are ready, the hours will resume." Love nodded slowly, struck again by how mild words could steady whole storms. Together they walked away, leaving the tower to its silence. Behind them, townsfolk already began shaping the whole affair into anecdote, scandal dulled into story, story into legend. But beneath those layers lay the truth, quietly secured, thanks to the patience of one inspector who had preferred observation to noise, calmness to spectacle. Councillor Hartley remained where all men do in the end, but his murderer no longer walked or wrote or sang. His clocked hour had come and gone, and justice, mild, certain, unshaken, stood in its place. Flaxborough, after its noisy interlude of ghosts, would have peace again, at least until the next scandal demanded attention. Purbright only smiled faintly, as though already aware the next case waited just around the corner, carrying with it new absurdities, new pretensions, and the same unyielding human folly that made death an inevitable visitor, an investigation a necessary calling.